Thank you all for coming. My name is David Domke. Thank you for being here. I'm joined with a great colleague of mine at Common Power.
Hey everyone, my name is Larcy Douglas. Really excited to share the stage.
Hello, I'm Bob Zellner.
Bob, yeah. So Bob, would you maybe start us off, please, by telling us, you knew Mrs. Hamer very well. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about knowing her and how much this play, which you've seen twice now, feels authentic or not, or how so?
Well, the play is very authentic. The writers and all the people that worked on the play have channeled Mrs. Hamer's spirit and just condensed it for us. And knowing her for so many years, it was like a reunion with an old friend. I was first hired on the SNCC staff in 1961 as a campus traveler, and my responsibility was to reach out to colleges and universities in the South and to talk to fellow white Southerners, basically, about what the freedom movement was about and where, as white Southerners, our position, what we needed to do in this freedom movement. So I traveled quite a bit with Mrs. Hamer because she was one of the field secretaries of SNCC who was a wonderful speaker. And she was known all over the United States and loved by many people. So I saw her in all kinds of situations, and I think that this play and the performance of her character has been so good. And one of the things that I remember about Mrs. Hamer so much is that she treated everybody exactly the same. She treated everybody with courtesy and respect, and she expected the same thing in return. And I saw her in many situations with very powerful people, and she treated those people exactly the same way she did anybody in Mississippi. And she was also very funny and absolutely fearless. And she was not a respecter of persons. So I have some stories about traveling with Mrs. Hamer and some of the things that happened. But one of the main things that I was close to Mrs. Hamer about was that there came a time in the middle 1960s, around 66, 67, when it became necessary for all of the white people who had worked on the SNCC staff to begin to systematically and seriously work with poor and working class white Southerners to bring them into the movement. And it was at a time in the movement when it was very difficult for African Americans and white Southerners to work closely together. But Mrs. Hamer became one of the main advisors for our GROW project, which we call grassroots organizing work, and we also call it Get Rid of Wallace. My own state governor of Alabama. And it was Mrs. Hamer who took the White People's Project under her arm and became our advisor, even to the point of introducing us to many of the poor and working class white Southerners that she was working with in the Delta of Mississippi. And she had found one of the keys to interracial organizing, and that was to have something that poor and working class white people needed, and they had to come to the black community to get that. And that was jobs sometimes, and it was direction and it was experience. So the poor white people in the Delta of Mississippi began to gather around Mrs. Hamer the same way the African American community had done. And they began to work with her in the Head Start program. And they not only brought their children to the Head Start program because their children needed what was available there, they brought themselves. And they were able to get jobs, maybe working in the kitchen or working on the grounds or working in the cooperative farm. Mrs. Hamer became an economic power in the Delta because she was such a creative organizer. And I remember when we started the GROW project, one of our problems was, how are we going to go to the very people who've been shooting at us and beating us and sometimes threatening to hang us up to trees? How are we going to go now and start working with them? And Mrs. Hamer said, well, you need to start off small. And we said, what do you mean by that? She said, you need to meet Mr. Traxler. You need to meet Ike Traxler. And so Mrs. Hamer introduced us to Ike Traxler, who lived on a little ways from Ruleville, and he lived on a bogue. It was called a bogue. Other people would call it a bayou. And Ike Traxler explained to us on the GROW staff that it was true the house was really not a house. It was more of a hut. It didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, but it was a great place to live, and it was cheap because it cost only $5 a year for him to live there. And he said, but we're very blessed because that bogue is full of alligator gar. And he said, my wife, bless her soul, and all the wives around this part of the Delta, they know how to make the best fish cakes out of alligator gar that you can imagine. So anytime we are so hungry that we have to have something, I can go out to the bogue there and catch some gar, and we've got food for the week, and we can share it with everybody. So then Ike Traxler began to introduce us to other relatives that he had all over the place, and we began to really get into the working class and white community in Mississippi, and she was very helpful for us in that.
You know, Bob, I want to actually take you back to SNCC. In the play, there are two moments that really stood out to me. One, when she mentioned that she was the oldest field secretary, right? And also, when she spoke about young activists, how she really gained a lot of inspiration from them. And she really understood two things: that the movement was bigger than her, but that young activists and young people can take it further out into the future. So I want to ask you, she had a natural ability to mentor. So there was John Lewis, who was probably your age at the time as well, Ruby Doris Smith, part of the mentorship crew. What was it like hanging out with her? And what was I guess what I'm trying to say is, what about her and who she was that really made sure young people folded into the movement?
Yes. Well, that was one of the geniuses, I think, of this performance, because you could not miss the childlike joy that Mrs. Hamer had in realizing that at age 44, she had a new life in front of her. So she had a new, it was like being brand new when she was 44 years old. She felt like a teenager because she was working with young people, who she looked up to, and they looked up to her. And she was the kind of person that you wanted to be with. People liked to be around Mrs. Hamer. And the local people in Mississippi, I know because I felt the same way. I felt safe when she was there because she channeled the courage. She exemplified the courage, and she distilled it and delivered it in such a way that she could give it to everybody that was around her. And we knew from experience already, because we had lost Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. My first 36 months with SNCC, I lost 6 or 8 of my friends were murdered. They were lynched by racists in Alabama and Mississippi, Louisiana, all across the South. So we knew that death and victory were very closely related. And the other thing that Mrs. Hamer exemplified was the love for children, and they loved her too. But she channels for me the anguish that I feel about the system of slavery. Because when we talked about the system of slavery, as a parent, I have 2 daughters, and between Pamela and I, we have 7 children. And I can't imagine anything more painful than being ripped from your family. And family was so important. And now we have people who say that they believe in family, and they're still in the process of ripping families apart by putting one person in the family, sometimes 2, in prison, in a continuation of the kind of slavery that existed hundreds of years ago. We still have so many residues from that. And so when she talks about the children, that reaches my heart, and I'm sure it reaches everybody else too.
Thank you, Bob, for sharing that. I really do believe that young activists and young people can carry it further out. And it really just shows you the simplicity of how we care for one another, where Miss Hamer created a space of safety, security, and love. And that is how everybody can be welcomed. And it's such a great message now with what's happening across our nation that it just needs to be that simple. And we need to find it someplace to be that simple. And as you heard Bob kind of bring a lot of that back, there's a lot of emotion there, and it's okay to share that with everyone. So thank you, Bob, for doing that. I wish, as many of you, we were able to be mentored by her as well. Thank you for sharing those memories.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to help bring a person like that forward. And a play like this presents that person in their wholeness to a whole wide group of people, and it's our history. And one of the roles that Mrs. Hamer played in the movement was, you can do these things and still survive. You can be in a community that is completely beleaguered and harassed day and night, and you can still survive and thrive. And I felt very close to her because that was one of the roles that I had in the early movement. I was supposed to be a campus traveler, and so a lot of people thought that I would stay out of the demonstrations and stay out of the possibility of being in jail. But I knew that if I was going to be a part of SNCC, I had to be a real SNCC person, and that meant that you had to be in the dangerous places. You had to put your body on the line, and that was the way that you really joined the youth movement of the 1960s and 70s. And so she showed me how to do that. And I was able to be involved in many of the most significant and ongoing projects of SNCC because I traveled around all the time. And one of my messages to young white Southerners was that you can join this movement and you're not going to perish, not right away. And some of us will, but most of us are going to be able to have a long life of struggle. I'm 82, and another 20 years I'll be ready to retire.
Bob, do you have maybe a story of Mrs. Hamer that you said about kind of meeting and treating people, whatever power or station they were at in their lives, that she would treat them all like regular people?
Well, I do.
Oh.
I do have a story like that, yes.
Great.
In 1964, when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenged the regular all-white delegation of Democrats from Mississippi and were not able to get seated at the convention, SNCC followed up with a congressional challenge to challenge the seating of all of the elected Democratic representatives from Mississippi. And part of that was a lobbying situation to lobby with people all around the country. And everybody said, we need to get Cardinal Cushing from Boston on our side. We need to get him to make public statements supporting the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Washington, and they should be seated rather than the segregated all-white delegation. And so there was a meeting, a staff meeting, and we said, who would be a good person to go and have a heart-to-heart talk with Cardinal Cushing in Boston, because he had been very influential in the Democratic Party, especially because of John Kennedy being from Boston and so forth. And everybody said, I think Mrs. Hamer needs to go and talk to him personally. So they planned a trip, and I happened to be taking off a little time from the staff, and I was studying sociology at Brandeis. So I was in Boston, or in Cambridge at that time, and my wife, Dorothy, was head of the Friends of SNCC for all of New England. So it was decided that Mrs. Hamer would come up to Boston, and my wife, Dottie, and also, hello, and also Maggie Nolan Donovan, who was an Irish Catholic young woman from Boston, we'd have a couple of days to work with Mrs. Hamer and get her prepared for a sit-down with Cardinal Cushing. And it was so typical of Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer when my wife, Dorothy, who was Jewish, and Maggie Nolan Donovan, who is Catholic, both of them talking to Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer, who is from Mississippi, about how to relate to Cardinal Cushing. And they explained that he was a prince of the church, and he was a very powerful person, and there's a certain protocol that you follow when you meet with the cardinal. And they are 4 or 5 different things. So let's go through them one at a time. And so the first thing they said was, when you come into the room where the cardinal is, you curtsy. And Mrs. Hamer says, I'm supposed to curtsy? And they said, yes. And she said, well, what is a curtsy? And so they both demonstrated with a very low curtsy. And Mrs. Hamer says, I don't think I'm going to do that. If I get down there, there's no way I'm ever going to get up. So I'm going to have to pass up the curtsy. And they said, well, okay, but you need to refer to the cardinal as your eminence. And she said, oh boy, I'm not even going to try that. And she said, and they all said, and when he puts out his hand, you're supposed to kiss his ring. And she said, kiss his what? And we said, we have to kiss the ring. And she says, I don't think I'm going to kiss his ring either. I think he's just a human being like I am. Why can't we just visit? And of course, that's exactly what she did. And it was very effective as it could have been if she had done all those things perfectly. He would have thought, well, how does this black woman from the Delta, Mississippi, know all this about how to do all this Catholic protocol? So that was the kind of person she was. She met everybody on the same level, and she was a true Democrat.
There's actually a rumor too that in her mentorship that she did not like the authoritarian approach. That she didn't like the fact that she was the older, therefore she should have a bigger sense of responsibility, that people would go to her. She really treated everyone equally, and I think that was also a really good approach to how she mentored youth, is that the youth can come into her space to really feel like they're on equal footing, which really gained her inspiration and stuff. So I know that we're gonna wrap this up here. Nabra, I totally see you over there kind of waving at us, but I kind of wanna set you guys, there's a story with Miss Hamer, and I don't know if we have time to tell it today, but it involves peanut butter right here.
Yeah, I have the peanut butter story.
Okay.
Have we got time for that?
Did I spoil the goods, David? No. Okay, so I'm getting signaled that we
Just
do
don't
have...
look at Nebra right now, okay?
So she's giving me the thumbs up. I think really you all need to hear this story. It's amazing. Okay, Bob.
Does anybody want to hear the peanut butter story?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, this is an example of how childish and how wonderful Mrs. Hamer could be. And in every town, in Chicago, in Boston, in Los Angeles, wherever Miss Hamer went, she would stay with the people, because we didn't stay in those days in hotels and motels and so forth. So she'd always stay with somebody. And in Boston, the people that always wanted Miss Hamer to come stay with them was Ralph and Rose Fishman from Brookline. And Ralph Fishman was a stockbroker, so he was quite well fixed, but they were ardent supporters of SNCC and the Civil Rights Movement. So Miss Hamer would always go and stay with Ralph and Rose Fishman. And just about anybody else from the South would always stay with Ralph and Rose. So Ms. Hamer was staying there, and one night Rose said to Mrs. Hamer right before bedtime, said, Ms. Hamer, would you like to have a peanut butter sandwich with some jelly? And she said, oh, I would love that. So Rose went and got the big peanut butter jar and some jelly and made them sandwiches, and they sat together and enjoyed their sandwiches. And so the next night, Rose said again, when it was about bedtime, would you like some more peanut butter sandwiches? And Mrs. Hamer said, oh, I would certainly love another peanut butter sandwich. So Rose went to the pantry and took down the jar, and she looked at the jar, and the jar was empty. It had been cleaned out so much that it looked like almost it had been washed, but it was just completely cleaned out. And Rose says, didn't we have peanut butter sandwich last night? And Ms. Hamer said, we sure did. And Rose said, well, we don't have any more peanut butter. And Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer said, well, I have to make a confession. She said, after y'all went to sleep last night, I went back and got that peanut butter. And she said, I never in my whole life had all the peanut butter I wanted to eat until last night. So that was, she was a person that was thrust into leadership in high places, but she was always the same person no matter where she was. And she wanted Rose to know how much she had appreciated the peanut butter.
That's the lesson in life, is to appreciate the little things and get some peanut butter.
Thank you so much, Bob. This is a play about an American great who changed our country, and you are one of those too. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Well, I just want to say that Pamela and I both are very, very proud of and happy that there is a common power that is continuing the work that Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer has done for so many years, and the work that we have done. And Pamela, we've got a home. We've got a home. And we love you all very much. Thank you.